Right. So, do you guys think you'd be able to like sum up or summarize? Well, Purdy, you probably wouldn't be able to, but Yorth, would you be able to summarize maybe what Timon's general idea is with assertoric non-descriptivism, which is kind of an absurd name for his theory. But yeah.
You can assign some supposed propositions to moral statements and just kind of declare that, okay, these behave in the way as propositions do. They refer to anything, and they're just a sort of logical construction in order to explain the behavior of sentences. So I think this is where he says, fact versus capital letter fact or something like, okay, it's not an actual fact about the world or about anything that's true or false. It's just a cynical fact, I suppose you could say it like that. So I'm not sure if that's correct or not.
Okay. So philosophers of language and metaethicists and these other people, metaphysicians especially, try to figure out like which relations are being posited by certain ways of talking. So you might say that a cognitivist says that there's a relation that obtains between moral sentences and the world, right? So you evaluate moral sentences with respect to the way the world is. And if, the world isn't that way, then moral sentences are false, and if it is, then they're true, right? Non-cognitivists would say that there is no such relation. Really, the relation that goes on between moral sentences and the world isn't a referring relation. You're not referring to properties out there in the world when you say that this or that is good. You're sort of an expressive relation, right? So the speaker, are expressing something. Timmons is saying that if you have a certain attitude about truth, like a deflationary theory of truth, then the word true, or saying things like, it's true that killing is good, doesn't always have to have a correspondence relation to the world, right? It could just have a relation to your other beliefs, or it could just have no relation to anything at all. It could just mean you're saying something. So if you say it's true that snow is white, you might just be saying snow is white. You might not be making a statement that relates certain properties in the world to what your beliefs are. So does that sound like a plausible view? I mean, I think it seems to deal with the Frege-Geach problem, because moral operators can be evaluated truth functionally on that view. It's just that truth isn't very interesting on that view, because truth doesn't have much to do with the way the world is. It just has to do with whether a certain proposition has been uttered or not.
Timmons gives you a way to avoid committing to any metaphysical statements or because if there really are objective moral facts or whatever it is that humor suggests there are, then that's a really bold statement about the world, and he might say, oh, it's not really about the world, but at least it accords with the intuition, similar to the way that in philosophy of mind people would say, we can prove based on I forget who it was that said this, but the guy who made the H2O XYZ argument, and in such a way as to Derek Parfit, I think, I don't remember, in such a way as to prove somehow that the mind is fundamental. That somehow seems intuitive, even though it makes sense syntactically. That's what Timmons is about. He's trying to avoid making extraordinary commitments based only on linguistic constructions.
Well, yeah. So I'd say that's a benefit of the view, right? I think Timmons is very serious about trying to make this sort of just not bullshitty and actually make sense. I don't know if I should say that, but yeah. So I'm not sure if in the supplementary text that I added, Metaethics After More, there are papers about assertoric non-descriptivism, but since it's written by him, there probably would be at least one I'd check. But I think that's probably the more interesting theory of expressivism out there. Although I would grant that humor is probably right in the sense that the claim doesn't so much distinguish him from sort of the other non-cognitivists in their attempts, right? So he sort of just goes back to Blackburn's ideas and Hare's ideas to try to get past the Frege-Geach problem, and then cashes out his idea in a sort of different semantic way. So I don't think we actually covered Hare very extensively, and I just wanted to review him really briefly because somebody had posted something that was actually very interesting, I think. Right, so somebody had this idea. Maybe a lot of moral language is implicit. Maybe it's not really explicit, right? So maybe people don't, when they're usually talking morally, maybe people don't say things like, that was good, or you should have done that, or that was great. People kind of shy away from those kinds of things these days, right? Because you don't really hear a lot of people saying, oh, it's morally abhorrent that you are okay with abortion or things like that. Usually, what they say is things like, yeah, in my opinion, I just don't do that. I don't like that. Personally, for me, I wouldn't say I wouldn't advise my daughter to do something like that. Or they'd say something like some roundabout personal way of saying that they disapprove of abortion, but they wouldn't say, this is immoral directly. And so this poster, Reasons Dialectic, had this idea that maybe expressions like, this person's post sucks, or abortion is lame, or abortion is just, ugh, how could you do that? Those statements are just nested or, shielded moral statements. And those are really the interesting moral statements, really. When people say something like, you should have done this, that's a sort of weak moral statement, it sounds like. And really, the basis for moral statements might be these desire expressive terms. Would you say that's a plausible idea? Like his particular insight was that, or her particular, I'm not sure, was so those expressive terms sort of form the basis for it, but part of it, they only form part of the basis for it, right? So there are two levels of analysis in moral terms. Sort of like when you, like the last problem on your assignment, you sort of gave a descriptivist chunk to the analysis of the word be, or the proposition be is stupid, right? There's the descriptivist part of that, which is saying, B contains various things that I disapprove of, such as obscenity, etc. And there's the evaluative part, or desire expressive part, which is boo, those things that I just mentioned, those things, blah, they leave a sour taste in my mouth. And so he's, or she is sort of just saying, moral sentences can be broken down into an expressive part, right? So that part is the first surface layer, and but the fundamental part is that they're prescriptions, right? So when you're saying something like that guy sucks, right? You're really just saying, don't respect that guy, don't listen to that guy, don't pay attention to him, behave in a certain way such that you shun him. And it seems like that does sound to me like it captures a lot of language, a lot of moral language, and I'm not sure whether it suffers from the same problems that the conjunctions that I was mentioning in the video suffer from. I'll have to actually try to check that and see. But speaking of that, would you guys think that you might be able to think of some other Frege-Geach problems, like before we just go on to the subjectivism thing? Could you think of other ways you can use logic to show that non-cognitivist analyses of sentences really don't go over well logically, besides the conditional way and the conjunctive way in the video? Right. Yeah. So, so you could mention uncertainty, right? So, but I'm not sure that's like a Frege-Geach objection, right? You might do an objection in terms of doxastic logic. So you might say it seems like you can have an operator. X believes that this is wrong, this or that is wrong. But they believe it to this degree, right? So they believe it to the degree P, where P is some sort of justificatory or epistemic support factor, or just a probability that they assign to it. So they think the probability that this thing is wrong is 0.7 or something. That seems like a thing that sort of makes sense to say, although it seems kind of formal to say. A better thing to say might be they think that it's sort of likely that this is wrong. They think it's sort of, this is probably wrong. I probably shouldn't be doing this. Many people probably say stuff like that. And it seems like you don't really have very good machinery for that if you're a non-cognitivist. I'm not sure how you would do belief operations like that with non-cognitivism. I don't think. Yeah. Also, as like a segue into the third chapter, the beginning of the third chapter, when Humer discusses individualist subjectivism, he says that subjectivists, because they say things like, X is good means I believe X is good, or X is good means, I X satisfies my uh, desires or interests, or X, I approve of X, or things like that. Sort of subjectivists sort of run into the same problem that non-cognitivists do in this regard, because they can't really say, what if I'm wrong about X being good? That doesn't really make any sense, because you can't be wrong about something that says, that whatever your beliefs are about X are correct, right? So if you say X is good, that's supposed to mean that you believe X is good. But if you believe X is good, then it seems like you can't have a wrong belief, because that's just what it means that you believe it. The only, like, you might say they could get out of that by saying, well, what if you're not sure that you believe it's wrong? But that sort of leads to sort of a strange regress, right? You might ask, I'm not sure if I believe this is wrong, and a subjectivist might say, I'm not sure if I believe this is wrong, and you might take that to mean, I'm not sure if I believe that I believe that I believe this is wrong. So it kind of gets weird, I think.
So, yeah, that's kind of interesting. I mean, you could reply to that with the way that the guy, the reasons dialectic posted, I think. Yeah, or basically the splitting into the subjective and non-subjective parts. So you could say, when people are unsure about whether something's wrong, they're not so unsure about, it's not that they're unsure about what is wrong or what the meaning of right is, just that they're unsure of whether this particular case applies to, I'm not sure if, we should go to war with them. It's because I'm not sure whether what the consequences will be or what going to war entails or whatever. I don't know, like, I guess it is possible to be unsure about your own preferences, even if you're. Oh, I mean, I'm actually not sure if you can say I'm unsure about my like fundamental values. I suppose you could. I suppose you could like suppose that if you haven't thought enough about this, then you'd be wrong about it. Just like I could say, oh, I'm unsure whether the Riemann hypothesis is true or not. And but the last thing that maybe I mentioned is that again I don't remember where I read this, but I feel like someone somewhere has defined like belief as something where the tower of belief in, that you believe it or whatever continues on forever. So like you can't really be said to believe something if you don't believe it, because belief is a sort of active thing. So anyway, what I'm saying, it isn't the strongest objection of non-cognitivism, I think.
That's interesting. So you can't. So if you claim, I believe that. Let's say I claim I believe that killing the Jews is wrong, right? You can't claim that you believe that, according to this view, unless you can also claim that you believe that killing the Jews is wrong. I think that's plausible if knowledge is closed under entailment, right? So if you're believing that killing the Jews is wrong is probably going to entail that you believe killing the Jews is wrong, right? In doxastic logic, it's supposed to entail that. But a lot of people don't think that knowledge is closed under entailment, right? So like I might be an idiot about logic, right? So it might be that, I know that if the Nazis invade Europe, then this will happen, and then this will happen, and then this will happen. But I might not be able to be skilled enough with deduction to put all those conditionals together and infer all of their consequences and say that I know all of them, right? Because there might be infinitely many consequences of those conditionals that I don't think I'm prepared to claim that I know an infinite amount of things. So I don't know. So given that knowledge isn't closed, I think that's a weird thing to say. Would you say that's true?
I guess, because I guess I mean, whether belief is closed under entailment or whatever it is, that's sort of a quasi-empirical claim about the way that brains work and the way that statements and beliefs are encoded in those brains. But I think it's pretty clear that the kind of broad statement is not like just because I believe the five postulates of Euclid or whatever, it doesn't mean that I realize that those things imply the Pythagorean theorem, and so I can believe those statements without believing what they logically entail. But it seems that if I also believe or know that if I believe X and I believe that X implies Y, it's hard for me to not realize that Y is also true. Maybe it's just because I'm confused or didn't think about it enough. But in like a certain sense, like as soon as that's pointed out to me, I have to believe that. But now I find myself sounding like the other guy, the guy who was talking about commitments. So
Yeah, maybe I don't. Yeah. Although, like, I'm tempted to say that some people who say they really do understand a conditional and they really do understand what it means for if this, then this, and then this to be true. I'm still tempted to say a lot of them might be like, but then F, not P or Q. And then you might ask them like, why F? And they give you some confused, fallacious answer. So a lot of people don't find logic that intuitive. So I don't know. But maybe. But in any case, some of these claims about subjectivism in the third chapter, I didn't find like the first parts of the chapter just deal with sort of humor, just saying this means that it's okay to kill black people and Jews. And so this is dumb. Obviously, it's not okay to kill black people and Jews. Therefore, subjectivism is false. So that's sort of the classic response, and it's not very satisfying, I think. I mean, it's mildly satisfying for humor to say a subjectivist can't disagree with another subjectivist because your truths in subjectivism are only with respect to you. But I don't think that makes for a very substantive objection. It's sort of obvious that you can't disagree with another person on subjectivism. But where I think is sort of interesting to consider in terms of the plausibility of subjectivism, right? So it seems like a lot of the things that are good for people, right? So, like, let's say something is good for me, right? It's a good idea for me to do something. Doesn't it seem reasonable to say that if it's a good idea for me to do something, then that doesn't necessarily imply it's a good idea for you to do something? Or isn't what's good for me like really a matter of me and not really you, right? Shouldn't that not depend on you? I mean, I think that's sort of a plausible intuition, I think.
if you like stick with a theory where everyone has their own preferences, then it leaves you unable to deal with cases where those preferences bring people into conflict in the physical world. And like some people might object that this is what the purpose of ethics is. Like it seems like a lot of the time where people get into really charged discussions is about sorts of issues. It's not nobody gets into discussions like they're whether like chocolate or vanilla ice cream is better. It's always something where one person's preference conflicts with another's.
Right. So humor points out like if the subjectivist is right, why have such strong feelings about, killing the Jews is wrong? Why isn't it more like you like chocolate, but I don't like chocolate? I mean, chocolate's your thing. I don't really like chocolate. Killing the Jews is your thing. But for me, I don't really like killing the Jews. You can do it. So it's sort of not the same sort of thing. But I don't think that's too interesting. Like, I think you could really easily, Jesse Prinz, I'm actually probably going to put up a paper by him in the syllabus. But he sort of discusses, a psychological experiment he did. He's a moral psychologist, and basically he put people in front of like a very shitty, like a bad desk, a very old, disgusting desk, and had them answer survey questions about morality. And then he put this other group of people in front of a very nice desk in a very nice environment. It was very clean and stuff. And they answered their series of moral questions. So they had questions like, is abortion right? If there are 5 people on the tracks in front of you, and there's one person on the other track, do you switch the tracks to kill the other, or vice versa, or whatever? And various ethical problems. And the answers completely just dramatically differed in terms of percentages depending on where they were seated, right? So if you were seated in the crappy desk, then you are much more likely to, make judgments that something or other is negative or be very judgmental, right? People normally wouldn't be judgmental morally, right? So you were likely to say things like, Paris Hilton does morally evil things, right? Normally people don't really say things like that. They'd say, I don't agree with what Paris Hilton does. But they wouldn't say like, she's evil, but they were just pissed because they were sitting at the desk. So that's sort of something worth considering in terms of how emotions relate to morality. But so Qwerty said, but in terms of moral good, it doesn't make much sense. Yeah, I agree. Given given that. Jesse Prinz, I think he's at Harvard. Yeah, I'm going to put a paper up on the syllabus, right? But so before, I'm going to sort of end this early because I presume you guys, it's a Friday and there are not that many people here, and I presume you guys want to do other stuff. But I did want to bring up like a slightly fun topic or a slightly interesting topic that I was thinking about that I was going to ask some friends of mine that sort of has to do with religion. And I know Evening Star is probably interested in the religious stuff. What's his name? Humor brings up briefly, very, very briefly, this, ideal observer theory in which God is sort of required for morality in the divine command sense. And he sort of goes into it in detail. I'm not really going to cover that much on Tuesday because it's not a very interesting theory, right? Most people think that that doesn't work at all. But yeah, there's a friend of mine sort of who works in the graduate department at my school, and he's this very staunch Christian person, and he comes up with all these weird ways of justifying Christianity. And one of the ways he did it was he said, actually, if you believe in morality at all, if you think the existence of morality is plausible, if you think their moral statements really can be true, then you're probably going to be committed to some form of subjectivism in which there's a perfect being whose actions you have to emulate in order to be perfectly good. And so you might ask him, well, why is that? There's a plausible thesis in metaethics that your actions, the best actions for you to do, are what an ideal version of yourself would do, right? Or would advise you to do, right? So if you went to some imaginary world and there was an ideal version of yourself, the best action for you to do in this world would be what that ideal version of yourself advises you to do. And who's more ideal, who's a better rational agent than God, right? So everyone who believes in this sort of plausible account of what it means to be the best action is going to have to believe that there's a God, that there's a perfect being, right? According to Kant, the best action is the one that's the most rational for you to do. He's a rationalist about morality. And so pretty much everyone agrees with Kant on that. So this sort of has to do with practical rationality, right? Most people, and we're going to talk about reasons later on in the course. You're going to hear a lot about internal reasons and external reasons. And most people think that reasons are really internal. At least moral reasons are really internal. And so I know the Phil Paper survey doesn't say that, right? The Phil Paper says survey says everyone's a moral realist and everyone thinks that reasons are external. But I think that's a bit disingenuous, right? Because the Phil Paper survey surveys a lot of philosophers, and I think most of them from the top 20 or so departments would be like, the reasons aren't external. That's ridiculous, right? But so what does this mean, right? So internalists just think that reasons for doing something have to have something to do with your desires or interests, right? They have to be connected in a way to you, to what would motivate you to do something, right? That seems reasonable, right? The theist internalists, right? They would say that God is going to be the best guy to know your desires, right? He's omniscient. He knows everything, and he's morally perfect, right? You might say, morally perfect is sort of a useless word here because the very fact that he's an ideal being and knows everything would already imply that he's best to rationally advise you on what to do, right? But so we can factor that one out, right? But we could still say he's perfect in non-moral respects, right? So he's perfect at decision making. He's the most rational decision maker possible. And so you might say for that reason, he's ideally suited, right? According to William Lane Craig and the other sort of subjectivist Christians in philosophy of religion and ethics, the best way to learn about what's a good idea, and actually really, if you're a subjectivist, the only way to learn about what's a good idea is to figure out what the greatest possible being, right, the most ideal being, e.g. God, would advise you to do, right? And they would say, that's going to be the Bible. But you might object to this by saying, but God's only a possible being, right? It's not necessarily, the ideal being doesn't have to actually exist. But then you could go into an ontological argument and say, well, the greatest being would have to be necessary So if it's even possible, then God's got to exist. So would you say that morality is really committed to the existence of a God? Evening Star, what would you have to say about that?
Um, I think I can believe that an ideal being would always act superior to the way that I might act. But I don't know that forces me to believe that there actually is an ideal being. Can you explain the entailment relation between believing that hypothetically an ideal being would always act with the utmost moral goodness?
So I'm sort of messing around with this a bit just because it's sort of kind of a funny topic. But I mean, I've considered this actually. I've considered this because I'm a theist, and I've considered whether God has anything to do with morality. And according to this guy, he has a lot to do with morality. And so you might give two reasons for thinking that, right? One of the reasons is more plausible than the other, right? So the first reason you might give is just conceptual, right? So you might say, if I was the best being, if I was the very best I could be, what would I be like? You might say, well, I'd be very, very powerful. I'd be very, very smart. I'd be very rational. I'd care a lot about other people, maybe. And I'd be necessarily existent, right? Because if I was only possibly existent, right, if I only, could or could not exist, that would be a lot lamer than if I was not necessarily existent, right? So this is sort of the grounds for the ontological argument. This is why if you say something like the greatest being doesn't exist, that's sort of contradictory because the greatest being has to have the property that it necessarily exists in order for it to be the greatest being. Otherwise, it's a being better than it. And so you might on those grounds say, therefore, if you're going to think of an ideal being, it's got to exist. And so I'll just leave you with that first one and then see how you take that. The other one has to do with naturalism.
So I think Kant handles that pretty well when he says that existence is not a property of a thing. You can have a property and you can have different degrees of that property, like how wet this is, and that could be a property of a sponge. But I don't see how existence could be a property of a thing.
So, would you agree with that, Yorith, that existence isn't a predicate?
Well, I've heard this 3-word or 4-word phrase as a rebuttal to the ontological argument, and I mean it sounds kind of plausible, but like I'm not really sure. It just seems like the ontological argument is such an extraordinary type of argument. It's again one of those things where you've supposedly proven that something actually exists based on mere hypothesizing, and it's not. I remember I said something similar as to the existence of moral propositions or whatever, but like to say that a proposition exists is not to make any commitment about the way that it actually is. But to say that a being exists is like somehow you managed to deduce something about the physical world from like sitting in your armchair, and that just like sounds very implausible initially. But I think I do agree with. I think that the problem they run into is just like, okay, so the most perfect being is a being which is necessary, but if you thereby disqualify everything which is not necessarily existent, then you might not be left with a perfect being in other respects. So we have, in the realm of beings which are merely possibly existent, we have free reign to choose someone who is has the best morals, is omniscient and rational, etc. But then once we suppose that this being must also exist, now we might not be able to find that being among the space of things which actually do exist. And so it's a bit like saying I define Harry Potter as a wizard who exists. That doesn't mean that Harry Potter exists just because I've defined it in such a way that it does exist.
Right. So yeah. So I don't want to turn this sort of into a metaphysics discussion too much, but so most people just would respond to that these days by saying necessary existence is still a predicate, even though existence isn't a predicate. And the reason necessary existence is a predicate is because it tells you something about an object that isn't, that is substantive, right? So if I said the stack of pennies, this is Kant's example, the stack of pennies exists, that's not different from saying, there's a stack of pennies over there, right? So the concept of a stack of pennies and then throwing in existence into that concept, that doesn't really change the concept of a stack of pennies. But if I say the stack of pennies is necessarily existent, that does sort of add something to the notion of a stack of pennies, because if you just have a regular stack of pennies, that stack of pennies can be destroyed, but a necessarily existent stack of pennies can't be destroyed. So necessary existence seems to tack on extra interesting properties to things. And so that's why people think that, you can make ontological arguments where the relevant property is sort of necessary existence, not just existence, right? But that's sort of still Phil religion stuff. A more naturalistic way to say that, the ideal being has to be a god might be, which is kind of funny that this is the natural way, the naturalistic way to do it. But you might say, if the ideal being didn't exist, right? If it was some kind of abstract thing like a proposition or Harry Potter or things that don't really exist that we sort of think about, right? Then how is that scientific? We want ethics that has to do with science. We want to naturalize ethics. We don't want this kind of weird, wishy-washy, I feel in my gut that slavery is wrong. No, slavery is wrong because it produces this amount of utility. This amount of utility is not okay, therefore it's wrong. Or slavery is wrong because I desire not to have slaves, or everyone desires not to have slaves, etc. Naturalistic terms is what we want for an ethical theory, according to some people. Humour doesn't think that at all. Humour thinks you should have magic for an ethical theory. I don't really agree with that. But most people think that your ethical theories should be compatible with scientific theories. And if they are, then they shouldn't posit these non-existent ideal beings, right? So if we want to believe in something like Rawls', veil of ignorance, and we want to think about this veil of ignorance where we're just being ideal beings and being perfectly objective, then that sort of being has to be able to, it has to really exist somewhere. It has to be causally relevant to us. So we have to sort of believe that there really is this sort of ideal type of being, maybe God, right? So that sort of move is saying, we need this kind of being to explain moral language. Therefore, this being exists, right? So that's sort of what the argument is saying. There's a bunch of moral language that seems propositional. Therefore, there's a God because it has to come from some kind of actual being for science to work it out. Would you say that's reasonable?
Just for the sake of clarification, is it that you're looking for the objectivity of the truth of moral claims, and that the objectivity comes from the fact that God commands that certain claims be false? So it's just basically like divine command.
So, yeah, I think this is what you're asking. It kind of conflates, as Dan Dennett would say, the being God with the idea of God. So just because idea of God is influencing my behavior, that doesn't mean that there actually is a real being, which is the embodiment of that idea, which is affecting my behavior. And I'd say that just because you're using a hypothetical being as a argumentative device or as a way of finding out things, that doesn't mean that we accept that they exist. I would like to go back to the geometry example, but just because we make statements about ideals, which are perfect circles, which are perfectly round, and say the radius is equal to the circumference is 2 pi radius, that doesn't mean that any actual perfect circles exist in the real world. We can still make statements about them and use them as can still be useful in the real world, even though the objects about which we're making statements don't actually exist.
If I could just say something about what Brett said, I think in the case of mathematical objects, the Platonist has a stronger point than William Lane Craig's point, because the Platonist at least says, look, we have statements about mathematical objects that want their objectivity for the and they're actually about mathematical objects. Our day-to-day statements about ethics don't usually refer to God. They just refer to human beings. So to say the truth of those statements, I don't see why we have to posit God like Platon on mathematical.
Right. Just as to what yours said, you might be a nominalist about mathematics, which most people are. Well, actually, most people aren't. Again, the Phil paper survey is completely not useful if you're a professional philosopher, I think, because it's very misleading. Like, most philosophers don't think art is an objective matter. Okay, it's a very misleading survey. But yeah, you might be a nominalist and you might say mathematical objects aren't real. They're sort of just conceptual mechanisms that we develop and refer to. And they're naturalistic because they factor into scientific theories. We need them for scientific theories to work, right? So you might take the same strategy like you're suggesting, Yorith, and do that for ethics. So you might say ethical objects, ethical properties aren't real. Ideal observers aren't real, but we need them in our ethical theories. So there's this sort of conceptual thing like Santa Claus that we need to explain things in the world. Um, and that move might work, but I don't think it works by itself, right? So I think ethical theories are a bit too weak compared to mathematical theories to have that much voting power, right? So like a mathematician might say to a scientist, look, if you don't have me, you're sort of, that's it, you're done. You can't do any science, right? But an ethicist can't say to a scientist, if you don't have me, you can't do any science. A scientist probably doesn't know what ethicists do most of the time, right? The scientist is probably confused at what ethics is all about. So I think ethics is going to need a bit more force than just like, what about nominalism? About the concept of God or ideal observers. But so evening brings up sort of an objection that humor raises for subjectivism in this God format, which is which God are we supposed to refer to here, right? So you might say that it's the God of Christianity, or you might say that it's the Muslim God who's the ideal observer, etc. It all becomes this relativistic, subjective mumbo jumbo. Or you might say, like Evening says, where do people get off saying that there's a God involved in any of this moral talk at all? People don't seem to say, when I hear some Joe on the street say abortion is wrong, it's not clear to me that they're referring to any sort of moral code in any religion at all. They might not even be religious when they say that. So how does that have anything to do with this ideal observer that happens to be the being posited by some or other religion that this person has never heard of? That seems very implausible. But I think you could just spruce that up by saying, you know, I think William Lane Craig just says things like, look, people might not know that the Christian God exists, but nevertheless they might refer to the Christian God. So people might say things like, the cause of the universe must have been a fairly energetic thing, or it must have been a fairly transcendental thing. They might say things like that and not know that actually Jesus caused the universe. So really they're referring to Jesus, but they might not know who Jesus is, right? So that's sort of worth maybe considering. A Christian theist would say that God wrote the moral law in the hearts of men, so when they say abortion is wrong, they are reflecting this. Yeah, so they might say, you know, you have him in your conscience even though you don't know it, which is kind of ad hoc, but yeah, I don't know. So I'm guessing you guys still wouldn't find this very compelling, right? You still wouldn't say that, you know, atheists are just screwed when it comes to morality. They just can't make sense of subjectivist statements.
Yeah, so what I say to that in reverse order, like, so about the point of, you know, like, I don't know, it's really the Christian God or whatever that I'm referring to, but it actually is. I think the whole point of this class of objections is just that the arguments of a purely philosophical nature, such as the ontological or moral perfect being hypothesis or whatever, like they don't have enough specificity to be able to actually establish things which, you know, which like orthodox religious people actually want to establish. So like a particular religion such as, you know, Christianity or Hinduism or whatever comes attached with a whole lot of extra baggage to say, like, not only does God exist, but, you know, God also was incarnated in Galilee in the first century, and you know, God did all these things in the ancient past, and therefore we should model. And also, you know, God exists, like, or God issued commands such as this. So I suppose we could entertain like the idea that that, you know, God can't exist in a purely abstract form, but like it's kind of useless in a religious sense. It's not really what most people talk about when they say God, I think. And the other thing is about, what was it? Yeah, so you said about how about nominalism and mathematics versus ethics. So I think like science isn't the, so you'd say like math is the science as ethics is the what. And I wouldn't say that what is science, math is the science as ethics is to, you know, like law or human behavior or wherever it is where people bring up ethical questions. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess it would take a little more thought to be more clear on this, but I think like ethical theorizing can still have some use, even if it's a purely philosophical thing. It's just not really science that would be useful.
Right. So like, if you're a cultural relativist, you might say, and so Cordy's question is about like, you know, or Cordy's sort of suggesting that ethical sort of concepts, first of all, and ethical frameworks are not really this universal thing that people refer to. But he's not putting forward a cultural relativist argument, so I have no idea what he's suggesting. So okay, never mind. People like Philippa Foot or people like I think Anscombe would say things like morality really doesn't have to do with your reasons for doing something. It doesn't. That's not important to the concept. What really matters to the concept is whether something is virtuous or not, whether something fits into an Aristotelian mean, whether provides a balance in your life, whether something reflects good character in you. It doesn't have a lot to do with whether you have a reason for doing something or something like that. Reasons have to do with like practical things, what to bet on a hand of poker or whether or not to gamble. Those things are unrelated to morality. Morality is about value and the way things are virtuous and things are not. But I'm not sure if it has to be not inherently motivating, right? So you might say that somebody could hold that that which is good motivates me to do things, but it doesn't give me reasons to do things. Some people might think that's nonsense, right? So J.L. Mackie might say, if you're motivated to do something, then you have a reason to do it. Otherwise, you're just crazy. But some people say, motivation doesn't have to be attached to reasons in that way. So then you can be motivated without it providing reasons. But yeah, there are various non-normative theories of ethics. Normativity is just this very recent trend, actually, in philosophy that started with Williams, and now everyone's crazy about reasons. But back then, people weren't that crazy about reasons. They were crazy about value, duty, things like this, goodness, intrinsic worth, but these weren't really attached to reasons and stuff. So, sorry about how that was mostly me talking. The seminar wasn't terribly busy that day, but um, towards the end there, QWERTY had brought up this paper by an Indian author, um, which discussed notions of personal identity and how they're different in Eastern cultures and Eastern philosophy as opposed to Western philosophy, um, and he was suggesting, or she was suggesting that uh, perhaps that difference between concepts of self in the West and the East, and perhaps other differences like differences in what we construe obligation to be, um, might entail that uh, people, there are different concepts of morality. Morality is not this fixed notion, or rather, it might be that Indians have more of a better track of morality. Indian philosophy has sort of a better grasp of moral notions than Western philosophy has been capable of, and those notions will sort of come into play. Notions of how to translate moral terms in distinct languages, and notions of what's necessary to be a moral term, right? So whether normativity or obligation are necessary in moral terms, um, that will come up sort of when we start reading Myth of Morality by Richard Joyce, in sort of the introductory chapters. I might make that material more available just early on, since it seems to be a topic that's coming up. And also the paper, the anthropology paper that he had brought up by that author is available on the website if you want to check it out.